Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to talk about a concept that isn't necessarily, as many things I do, well supported by a bunch of previously existing written research. And I'm actually going to some degree speak about research. So the fundamental concept that we'll be able to overlay on a bunch of different things is the critique of many things is you didn't do it the way that I would have done it, or you didn't do it the way that everybody else does it. Now, the fundamental retort to that, so you didn't do it my way, or you didn't do it the way that everybody does it, the fundamental retort to that is, well, if I did it your way, the best I could ever be is you, and I'm not good at being you. So, what does that open up the door to? Let's just say you're an osteopathic professional. Excuse me clearing my throat. It'll happen again. I got something going on in my throat like I often do. If you're an osteopathic professional and you have questions about cranial approaches, or you have questions about visceral approaches, or you have questions about the mechanistic stories that underpin osteopathy, well, you're not talking about osteopathy the way that everybody else does. Therefore, the critique is you don't get it. If you are an osteopathic professional that likes, say, a mechanical approach, or a biomechanical approach, that's the term I'm looking for. You like a biomechanical approach. Well, anybody who prefers something that's not a biomechanical approach, well, you don't talk about it the way that I would talk about it, so you don't get it, right? You don't get the true depths of osteopathy. Most hands-on professions are fractionated in this way. System chiropractic versus classic chiropractic. What did I see? Orthopedic physio. There's all kinds of different ones. You look at massage therapy, you've got people who prefer instrument-assisted soft tissue mobilization, IASTM, such as the blades, like the metal blades. You'll see people who have a preference for cupping. You'll see some degree of wet cupping versus dry cupping. Wet cupping, probably not actually going to see in that many places because the skin has to get broken to do it, so you have laws around that. You'll have a bunch of different preferences. So a lot of the conversations that happen in hands-on manual practice are, you don't talk about things the way that I talk about them, therefore you don't get it. I've had conversations. Have I had those conversations? Maybe I haven't had those conversations necessarily. There's an impression that I have from encountering the conversations of others in a written format online that I feel like I was part of the conversation, even if I wasn't, but I've observed them. Things like, the biopsychosocial model, things like pain theories. I've encountered those in certain ways, and I've gone and looked at source material, so I sort of feel like I was part of the discussion, even if I wasn't. But if you support one of those, anybody who doesn't support the one that you support, well, if you don't think about it my way or talk about it my way, well, you don't get it. If we extend this out to, say, things that I'm familiar with in health science education, health professions education, so HSED or HPE, you will see consistent issues between jurisdictions. So if you want to work in jurisdiction A, but you were trained in jurisdiction B, there's all kinds of administrative paperwork that is predicated on the assumption that if you weren't trained in the jurisdiction that I'm responsible for, I can't trust that you do what you say you do. Then you have problems with how you evaluate that administrative paperwork. So if jurisdiction B has a different administrative standard, well, they don't do what we do, so we can't really vet it. We got to do this, we got to do that, you got to pay us a bunch of money. You'll see this in foreign trained medical graduates from one place to almost any other place. You will see this with a lot of healthcare professions. So RMTs who were trained in Australia would then have a hard time working in Canada. RMTs, same thing, trained in Canada, maybe have a hard time working in Australia, vice versa. If you weren't trained and did it the way that I think it should be done, then you don't get it. You didn't do it right, got to do this a different way. We extend this into the research realm with respect to the concept of being printed in a medical journal, not a medical journal, being printed in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. The process of peer review is considered a standard. The process of peer review has some pros, some cons, but it's considered a standard. So if you do some form of experimentation that doesn't go through peer review, and you attempt to share those results, the common critique, the easy critique is, well, it didn't go through peer review. It's not in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, right? It's like, yeah, well, if it was in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, it could only be what that is and no more. So one of the things that may be happening in a lot of professions that are attempting to get their feet under them with respect to the stories that they tell mechanistically, such as osteopathy, because that's what I talk about, it's what I do, trying to go through the administrative process and the peer review process as it stands may not be the best way. You're asking, now there's a way in which this is sort of rebellious and maybe doesn't line up with some of what I actually think, but the attempt to work through this verbally in an explicit fashion gives me the opportunity to take multiple directions. So if you want validation from the academic world and you want validation from the university world and the peer-reviewed science world, well, you got to do what they do. So there's hoops that are whatever hoops they are, you jump through them or else we don't validate you. You are not what we say that you are. The underlying assumption of going through the peer-reviewed process is that there is something meaningful about it, and there is. But if you don't do that, then you aren't one of those things. Osteopathy does have a long history of making the argument that we are not one of those things. We are something different. The problem that we've run into writ large is that we've made claims that when examined are not substantiated. They are not valid claims. The claims are not what they say they are. Instead of spending lots of time and energy trying to be the currently existing, not the classic, not necessarily the standard, but the currently existed academic model may not pay dividends because it means you have to spend a lot of money on paperwork. You have to spend a lot of time on paperwork. If you listen to researchers who started their careers, say in the 80s, the 90s, or previous to those periods of time, their skill in research and the speed at which they could do it, the actual experimentation, has probably increased greatly, but their ability to get it done and get it out in the methods requested has slowed down heavily because of things like review ethics boards and the peer review process. One of the challenges with the peer review process is that you need people to review your work that understand it well enough on a technical level that they can actually examine it in a meaningful and accurate way. That means, fundamentally, that the people who are reviewing your work, even though it's blind, probably know exactly who you are, and there's going to be some hallmarks, so they take your name out of it, they keep the reviewer's name out of it, but you probably know exactly who one another is based on hallmarks of how you're communicating in the written word while de-identified. So let's just say you have a competitor who is one of the few people who could actually technically review your work. They see your work, they see it's interesting, they find some silly technical thing to push back on it, to slow you down. Maybe they go and possibly try to reproduce and beat you to the punch, reproduce your work and beat you to the punch. So there is one criticism of peer review that it's not essentially, it's more like peer preview is the term that I've heard. So your competitors get to preview your work before it gets published or block its publication through the review process. So it's like you're giving them a sneak peek. Now, that's probably not the case in osteopathy, although I've had a very, very small brush with something that would suggest it could be that. Because one of the criticisms that I received on something that I submitted somewhere was that it wasn't lining up with the fundamental message and aim of the particular journal. Now, the journals are allowed to have their aims set forth and their rationales for that, and rejects on those concepts. Like that's a thing. If you've got a clubhouse, you get to discriminate who gets into the clubhouse and who does not get into the clubhouse. So discrimination is a word that essentially suggests the ability to discern between something that is and something that isn't. Peer review is a very discriminatory process, right? So say in colloquial social terms, there's a different view of the term discrimination. It's probably a very loaded term, or I would say it is a very loaded term, but I'm not going to necessarily point in any directions that others may think because they don't think like me. But we socially and colloquially value a highly discriminatory process with respect to research. Now, what my general suggestion after sort of rambling through that would be is to figure out what the heck the good stuff is about the iterative process of research and academia. Extract that to the best of your ability and try to minimize the other stuff, the stuff that slows it down, the stuff that limits what it can or cannot do, the stuff that makes it harder to do the different thing that will allow you to explore things where there may be interesting phenomenon to be found. If you want to publish in a currently existing journal, you've got to go through the normal administrative steps. You've got to go through the peer review or the peer preview, whichever term you prefer. If you want to be a little bit more mischievous, you probably like peer preview. You've got to go through the review ethics boards. Okay, well, what's the point of an ethics board? The point of an ethics board should be to make sure that you're not causing harm to any research subject. If you're a reasonable researcher on any level, you should not cause harm. It would be in any researcher's best interest to behave in a way, especially in healthcare, as guided by the Latin primum non nocere, first do no harm. Right? Beneficence, or that, no, actually, my apologies. Non-maleficence is the proper term. First, do no harm. Second, once you are able to identify that it is highly unlikely that what you're going to do is going to cause harm, then cause benefit, right? Whatever you choose to do should reasonably be predicted to cause benefit. You should also allow people to understand as much of the pros and the cons of what could or couldn't happen, and then they should always be able to say no, right? So the medical ethics for healthcare practitioners should predictably negate the requirement for a review ethics board. Now, I think review ethics boards have value. I think the manner in which they end up applying their process probably slows down and stops more things than it allows to occur. Some of those things may not need to be stopped. Some of those things absolutely need to be stopped. So there's a pro and a con there. But if you can take the fundamentals of healthcare and say, I have an ethical code that even in research or experimentation, I need to abide by that, that technically, not absolutely, but technically should negate the requirement for any healthcare research of a review ethics boards because, well, you're already bound to medical ethics or healthcare ethics, whichever term you prefer. If you understand that having a clear, traceable methodology will allow other people to examine your work and reproduce it so they can test and see if your method consistently produces the outcome you say it produces. If you do that, then you probably have something that can allow you to go forth, behave ethically, do experimentation, and not get bogged down in the stuff that is probably going to make it hard for osteopathy to test itself to make reasonable claims. I completely understand the lure of the currently standing institutions. One of the challenges that people who are on the outside looking in probably lack the knowledge of how they got the way they got, why they are the way they are. These institutions have a large amount of administrative burden. Some of that is going to be through a little bit of mischief. Some of that's a little bit of make work. Some of that is legitimate issues that people were attempting to solve, but the people that were attempting to solve them really, really seemed to like paperwork. So the administrative burden, almost everywhere you look, on almost every profession, has gone way up. Productivity could be maintained, right? So you may have the same output of many professions, but because the administrative burden has gone up, everything gets more expensive. So science gets more expensive because you have to pay people to do your review ethics packages. You have to pay people to, schedule things. You have to pay people to clean equipment. You have to pay people to do this, pay people to do that. And you have to train them. So you have to pay them to be trained. So everything just gets more and more and more expensive. What I would say is trying to reproduce that model, especially with people who have expertise in that model, they can reproduce it. So if you're an osteopathic practitioner, an osteopathic school owner, what have you, and you want to get into the scientific world, you're going to pay a lot of money to move really slow. If that is what you're motivated to do, if that's your axiological or value-based choice, I understand. I am attempting to make the case to take the good stuff out, leave the slow stuff, the stuff that is maybe less comfortable, more cumbersome, leave it behind. It's what I'm doing with my students here at the Osteopathic Lyceum and their thesis work, which is experiment-based. I'm trying to share that information the best I can. I'm overviewing all their ethics. They're already, as students, bound to healthcare ethics anyways. Anything that they submit to me that may cause harm, I won't allow them to do it, right? I won't allow them to run that experiment and figure out the results. So I'm attempting to take all of the good things from the current academic research world and leave all of the bad things. Me talking about this is a way for me to express it out loud such that for posterity or for future, anybody who, again, scratches at this and looks can see that I have very clearly, purposefully put this out. I've said things of this nature before. I'm saying this maybe in a more distilled way with a decent amount of rambling to try to get the point out that if you look back at this in the future, you'll see that I've been advocating for this for a while. So hopefully you took something away from that, you learned something. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.